express all of our gratitude to the sponsors of Harrison for another long series of generous bequest this evening for all of us. And then I'm really fortunate also to have the three top people at National Review as my friends, the people I respect, Andy McCarthy, Jack Dolan as well. I think they managed a really difficult time in the conservative movement. We've never tried sort of Trump, always Trump, trying to reconcile this. And I think without those three, things could have been catastrophic. I thought I'd just speak for about 6 or 7 minutes because World War II was 6 years long. And there's 7,000 books written every year on World War II. When you say you're going to read World War II, the editors in New York say, you've got 5 seconds to tell me why I should listen anymore. And they're very skeptical. But one thing to remember, if you just looked at the war from a fresh perspective of who got killed and who didn't, 65 million people. It was the largest human catastrophe in the history of civilization, even greater than the entire 14th century death toll from the Black Plague. World War I, remember, was only 17 million civilian. But what was very strange about World War II, unlike any other major war, was the defeated lost far fewer. The defeated being Japan, Italy, and Germany lost far fewer than the victorious. Of that 65 million, only 10 million were on the defeated side. The victorious lost the great majority. And if you break it down even further, of the 65 million, 80% or almost 50 million people were out of uniform and unarmed. And of that 50 million, about 45 million were either in Eastern Europe, in Russia, or China. 16 million in China, 27 million in Russia, about 10 million in Eastern Europe. If you want to distill that down into a way of looking at World War II in a different way, besides Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Bulge, the Blitz, it was essentially 6 years of Japanese and German soldiers killing people in Eastern Europe, China, and Russia that didn't have arms or were not in uniform. It's the greatest butchery of armed, experienced soldiers against the innocent. It kind of reminds us to talk about contemporary terms that when people go to war, and whether it's in Syria or whether it's in Vietnam, people on both sides have guns and they're organized, and the real casualties are usually unarmed world civilians. They're in the way and they're not armed. Forget that. Second thing I think is very important to realize about World War II is that everybody thought the war was going to be over about every 3 months. Germany invaded September 1st, Poland in 1939. They defeated in 20 days, the war was over. You look at contemporary news, Polish war's over, no war, World War II. Still called World War I the Great War. And then they went into Norway, defeated it. And they went into Belgium, Luxembourg, France, defeated it, and the war's over. Now there's a Yugoslavia war. It's over. Greece, it's over. By 1940, in May, Germany had everything that's in the EU today. And with Italy from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Russian border to the Channel. And then they did something very stupid. This is also a way that the people win initially in the war, they never think it's true business or any human experience. Let me take a deep breath and ask myself why I am successful. Is it luck? Is it my own efforts? Is it the stakes of the enemy? And then calibrate we will always be lucky. Sort of like Hillary Clinton painting in Arizona on a red state within a mandate. She's in her backyard. There's no need to do it. It's stupid. She was convinced. After winning 10 of these border wars, Hitler was convinced that he was unstoppable. So he won World War II up to May 1941. He had the entire territory of the EU in his possession. And then he made 3 of the most stupid decisions in hindsight that he could make in Boston. declared war on Russia, which was under Stalin, the Soviet Union was his ally. And suddenly he attacked a country that had 12.5 million people under arms, had better tanks, and had a population that was 2.5 times larger than Nazi Germany. 6 months later, he declared war on the United States on December 11th, who had the 130 million and had the largest GDP even during the Depression of any country in the world. And 4 days earlier, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the third greatest state. And suddenly, the victory, Japan had inherited, remember, all of the Pacific, because there was no colonial France, no colonial to Netherlands. They had the Dutch East Indies, they had Vietnam. All they had to do was not attack the United States. All Hitler had to do was not attack Russia. And suddenly it was not Germany versus England or Italy versus Greece. It was 400 million people in the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain against 160 million. And the GDP was about 6 times larger. In fact, by 1945, the GDP of the United States was larger than all of the Allies and Axis put together. So then we called World War I World War I. It was no longer the Great War after 41, because this thing, whatever this thing was now a world war. And it was just a simple, the way to remember World War II, it was just a simple race to the finish. And that is, after having a 5-year head start at arming and a 2-year head start in fighting, would Italy, Germany, and Japan be able to defeat the Allies before they rearmed and the population and economy split in? For one moment in the fall of 1942, the Germans were in sight of the Caspian Sea and the oil of Russia. They had landed, the Japanese had landed at Guadalcanal. They were going to cut Australia off of North America, and Rommel was 60 miles, 70 miles from the Suez Canal. And the German army was about ready to cut the Volga off at Stalingrad. 3 months later, it had all disappeared. In 43, 44, 45, it was simply a question. If the Allies wanted an unconditional surrender, were they willing to pay the price for it? And that meant, were they willing to lose a great number of dead? Because it was one thing to defeat Germany and Japan, and it was quite another thing to go in and destroy Tokyo and Berlin. And given their fascistic governments, that was necessary. Final observations about some other observations that are applicable to the present. I think one of the things is deterrence. This is what I think this administration is trying to do. Deterrence, remember, as Lord Halifax said in the 17th century, we hang horse thieves not so people don't steal horses, but because they stole horses, but so people in the future will not steal horses. And for all the economic power of the United States, for all the military power of the Soviet Union, the Soviets had collaborated under the non-aggression pact with Hitler. The United States had been isolationist, and the British and French had refused. So even though they had even France and Britain had a greater army and a better airplane and a better tank than Germany when they invaded. And so something's very dangerous when you're a very strong power and you allow people to be aggressive that are weaker than you, not the same level of power. So what's very interesting about North Korea and Iran, they're much, much weaker than the United States, but they keep being aggressive, and they promulgate this narrative that they could do this to the United States because the United States is embarrassed of its weakness, or it can't, it's self-controlled. But that's really when a war starts. It's when a powerful country, for a variety of psychological reasons, does not react. A couple of other things very quickly. It's better to make a lot of stuff that is adequate than just a few things that are perfect. The perfect is always the enemy of the good. You don't have to be perfect to win. So if you want to make, World War II autodidacts always say the Tiger tank, the Panther tank, 4 inches of armor, 88 millimeter. Look at that poor Sherman. We made 52,000 Sherman tanks. They made 1,600 Tigers. It took an hour and a half to take the transmission out of a Sherman tank. It took 2 days for a Tiger. It took 1 hour of maintenance for a Tiger, 1 hour on the road, 10 hours on the road, 1 hour of maintenance for a Sherman. And the same thing was true about the B-1 programs, the II, that Germany did, the big rail guns. They always wanted to have the ideal, utopian, best German craftsmanship, and they failed to make things that were good enough and in great numbers like the United States did. And then final observation is I think sometimes we underestimate Great Britain because the Soviet Union is a colossus in World War II, so were we. But these two latest movies, Dunkirk and Finest Hour, remind us that Britain was the only country that fought Germany alone. They did, remember, from the fall of France on June 21st, 1940 to the attack on the Soviet Union a year later on June 22nd, 1941. It was the only country that went to war for a principle without either attacking another country or being attacked. And that was, it went for the principle of saving Poland. It was the only country that fought the very first day of the war, September 1st, 1939, and the very last day of the war. And then finally, we think that we supplied the GDP at 12.3 million, the Soviet Union had 12.5, Britain only had 5 million, but most of the great breakthroughs in the war, whether it was the P-51 Mustang with a Rolls-Royce engine in it, or sophisticated sonar and radar, or anti-submarine, came from the British. So I think that we should really stop for a second and cease looking at them as the weak link. This is not well beyond the leadership capability of Churchill. With that, I'll open a few questions.
You wanted to talk a little about current lessons from your book.
Well, I think a couple of things that is very disturbing for me when I speak on college campuses is we have created an entire generation that is combining the classical worst traits in one's person, is arrogance and ignorance. So you'll have students who will come to you and they'll say, didn't you know that Britain was a colonial power? And didn't you know that Britain was culpable? And then you just say, okay, would you please tell me the colonies that Britain had? They can't name one. And don't you think we shouldn't have dropped the atomic? The biggest question I get when I speak on campuses, our hands are bloody because we dropped the atomic bomb. So then I always say, would you please give me the alternatives to dropping the atomic bomb? And nobody, and a crowd of 1,000 people not wants to say anything. So when I said, let us go through them, it's like teaching kindergarten. And I said, they were killing 20,000 Asians a week, they being the Imperial Japanese. Do you want to not drop it? And you're going to lose another 2 or 3 million people. I said the 2 invasions of Japan were not scheduled till March and November of 1946. We had fought in Okinawa. It was the worst defeat of the U.S., not defeat, but worst cost of the U.S. Navy, 5,000 dead, another 8,000 Marines dead, and Army. 50,000 wounded, and this was, remember, just weeks before the dropping of the bomb. If you look at contemporary papers, they're not mad that we dropped the bomb. The parents of those who were died in Okinawa said, you knew the bomb from test was applicable in July, and you put our boys on Okinawa and they got killed, while you had atomic bombs in a hangar. True. And finally, I'll give you another example. What was the alternative to the bomb? Curtis LeMay had the B-29 force. Remember, he was firebombing Japan. 2,500 bombers. He had 2,500 on order. Where he was leaving the Mariana Islands was 1,700 miles from Japan. He had just taken Okinawa, was 350. World War II in Europe had been over since May 8th. There were 10,000 U.S. B-17s, British Lancaster bombers, B-24s, 10,000 of them, and another 5,000 B-26s and B-25s. What did May's plan to do? He wanted to bring all those 12,000 bombers with his 5,000 B-29s that he wanted to fly them 2 missions a day to burn down Japan that was already 65% burned down. So you can imagine, had we not dropped those atomic bombs, it would have been a forest fire and killed millions of Japanese. And yet, when you try to explain that to students, they've just been inculcated that World War II represents American racism, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, almost anything, and yet we haven't taught them anything about what
final observations will be final, and then you can ask questions. I spoke not too long ago at a campus, and we had this discussion that it was very hard to speak because nobody in the audience knew what the Battle of Bulge was. Nobody knew what D-Day was. Nobody had any idea of what a B-17 was. So it's almost like they're speaking hieroglyphics to these, yet they were all social justice warriors, students. So it was very hard. So, you know, at the end of it, I was trying to, how could I reach students? What could I say? What can you possibly do? And I asked them to give me alternatives to World War II. And you should have heard the alternatives. They were all, we shouldn't have fought back. And I said, okay. So the Holocaust was only half finished. 6 million, there were 12 million Jews. The Chinese was, the Holocaust in China was 16 million, they wanted to kill 50. So that's okay. Well, they would have stopped on their own. I said, when in history is an aggressor who was successful to stop? So I guess what I'm saying is that we as a society, if we're going to be confident in our values, free speech, free market economics, etc., we really need to have a common core of knowledge, body of knowledge that everybody not just knows names and dates, which are important, but they have to realize why we fought the Civil War, why we fought World War I, why we fought World War II. If you don't know that, then you go in one night and you tear down statues because they're all bad and they're Confederates, and you tear down Nathan Bedford Forrest, maybe okay, founder of the Ku Klux Klan. The next night you tear down James Longstreet, who never owned a slave, objected to the Confederacy, but felt that he had to fight for the Confederacy as a Southerner, and then after the war, helped Reconstruction. But it doesn't matter, it's all blurred, they're bad, these are good. I think it's been a real challenge writing this book and trying to explain it to college campuses to a whole generation that's historically illiterate. And not just illiterate, but arrogant about their illiteracy.
A little applause before we do some questions. And we'll try to use our lungs while
Yeah, this one's
Victor, I have a question. I have two questions.
Yes.
First of all, please explain this whole notion of world wars too, because it says way much more than it seems. And then the second question is, today or yesterday, I was reading through the book, and I get to the point where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships and stuff came out in 1943, and you make the point that all of it was designed and organized and bought by Carl Vinson, or his efforts, before 1943, before December 7th, 1941. So clearly the nation saw that it was going to be at war. And it's kind of interesting because it wasn't, I mean, while Pearl Harbor might have been a surprise, the notion of war was certainly not a surprise.
Well, I'll be happy. The thing to remember first is that if we're in the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, Britain, they don't use the term World War I. They call it First World War and Second World War. The only reason I said the Second World War is that I couldn't figure out a plural of World War II's. It would sound good. So that's the first thing. But there was no concept of World War I until about 1941. There had been wars, the Finnish War or the Polish War of 23 or the first year, where a couple of people said this is another world war, but it didn't gain common acceptance. So what does that mean? That means in 1939 and 1940, we call it World War II. The people who were fighting it did not call it that. There was the Polish War, the Dutch War, the Belgian War, the Norwegian War, the French War, the Battle of Britain, the war in the desert, the Yugoslavian War, and the Greek War. Once they invaded the Soviet Union, i.e. the Germans, That was the most multinational invasion in history. 4 million people from about 17 nations. It wasn't just the Germans. 1 million of them were non-German. At that point, everybody said, oh my God, now we're in World War. We better go call the Great War World War I, and we'll call the new one and go in World War II here in America. That's when it started. As far as Carl Vinson, people had been very scared in the 1930s because Japan had, after the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese fleet had blown the Russian fleet out. Nobody thought the Asians, they were very racist, could do this. And then they started to discover there were 250,000 Japanese engineers, it's kind of like China today, that were studying maritime archaeology, nautical design, everything in France and Germany. They came back and they started from scratch. And by 1930, if you look at aircraft carrier design, battleship design, the Japanese were ahead of us and equal to the British. At that point, a very strange congressman, Carl Vinson, got alarmed. People thought he was kind of crazy. In 3 successive naval acts from 1933 to 1940, he planned to build 16 new battleships, 145 carriers, of which 28 were fleet carriers, small escort fleet, and then about 70 cruisers. And according to this, remember this is in the middle of the Depression, and if you read his testimony, he said, if we can have our way by 1944, we'll have a Navy larger than all the navies in the world put together, and then they won't attack us. He had the right idea, they attacked us earlier, but that dream was fulfilled by 1943. So by 1943, the United States, answer to your question, had a bigger Navy than the British Navy, the German Navy, the Italian, Japanese, put together. All new, all better design. It was the most formidable achievement you could imagine.
Just for practical purposes, I think we have about 5 minutes more for Victor. Everyone will be about half an hour. So, any questions? Jason has the microphone.
In your opinion, if Iraq attacked Turkey from the rear, would Greece help?
Greece help.
I was joking.
Need help attack Turkey?
No. Bad joke. My dad took the last town of World War II in Oklahoma. He was in the 96th Division. I wouldn't have been born if that mom hadn't done it, so I understand what you're saying. In knowing, especially Hearst and Joe Kennedy and some of the research I've done, if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened, what do you think? I mean, I know Churchill was trying to get us get help, and we weren't doing much, and there was so much. I guess I'm trying to parallel it today with appeasement and, let's get out as opposed to then. I'm just curious, in your expert opinion, what would have brought us in, if that hadn't happened?
Well, I don't think we would have gone in because for all of Hitler's boast about a American bomber, a 4-engine bomber, he never built a single 4-engine bomber. Could not do it. He tried putting 2 engines on a cowling on both sides, and two cowlings on each side. It didn't work. Never built one aircraft here. So,
Yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Yeah, this works a little better, doesn't it? Get away from the speakers, thank you. So, I guess what I'm saying is that he had no ability to attack the United States, and that was known to the Roosevelt administration. So their attitude was, he can talk all he wants, but if he's not going to build a long-term bomber, a long-range bomber, and he doesn't have the Azores, and he doesn't have an aircraft carrier, he can't touch us. And so we were more and more worried about Japan. Had Japan not attacked, would we have done anything? No. We sat there while they took the Dutch East Indies, and they had 70% of their oil at that point. They took Southeast Asia from the Vichy French, and they would have, if they took Singapore, we wouldn't have done anything. The only thing that made us get in the water, they did something very stupid. They attacked the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, and you can see in the Japanese transcripts, the discussion, there was a huge discussion. A lot of very brilliant Japanese said,
just take these orphan European defeated countries, the Netherlands and France, steal all their colonial resources. They don't exist anymore. Attack the Soviet Union from the east in cahoots with the Germans, and don't touch Pearl Harbor. But once that happened, we would have never, even at that point, we would have never, I think, gone to war against Germany. Then out of the blue, Hitler wakes up one morning, 4 days later, he declares war to the United States. And if you read the transcripts of the general staff, the Oberkommand of the Wehrmacht, they say, Wilmot calls up, he said, Keitel, and he says, what did the Fuhrer do? And then they said, call Goering. And so Goering said, what'd you do, mein Fuhrer? And he said, I declared war to the United States. And Ribbentrop drew it up, and they said, why did you do that? And they tried to reason with him, and people, I don't know how accurate this is, because a lot of people later tried to say that they were wiser. But they said they landed 2 million people in World War I in one year. After being unarmed, they landed 2 million people in France. And they said after having no munitions industry, by November of 1918, they were producing more artillery shells than all of France and Germany and Britain put together. Are you crazy? And he said, we can attack their shipping, we weren't able to sink their ships, we had U-boats are off the coast. And Admiral Gurnett said, yes, we have 12 of them. That's it. And he said they are building 12 U-boats a month. And so it was an emotional response, otherwise we would not. We were going to attack Japan. For 4 days we thought we were just going to destroy Japan, and then they declared war on us. And then it was suddenly Europe first. And then Roosevelt panicked, and everybody got together, the first Joint Chief, Admiral Leahy, and Marshall, and they said, boy, we got to sell this to the American people, that the country that attacked them is secondary, and the country that hasn't touched them is primary, Germany. And that was a hard sell. And so that we say Germany first. If you look at the actual way we did it, was really sneaky. We took the entire Marine Corps and put them all against Japan, and not one Marine fought in Europe. We put all the B-29s, and it was later, we put most of the submarines, most of the aircraft carriers. So while one was supposedly first, we just bifurcated our resources and tailor-made them to fighting the Navy in Japan and fighting the Army.
Quick question.
We have time for one question.
You hear these conspiracy theories that Washington knew that Japanese were going to bomb these things if they panicked, so that it will happen and we will enter the war. I mean, movies, books, is there any truth in that?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Britain was trying to bring us in. And the night of Pearl Harbor, Churchill said, this is the first night I've slept soundly since the war started. So they were delighted, the British were, because they knew they could win the war if we got into it. And Roosevelt thought it was going to come one way or the other. He would have preferred it come in 1942 or 43 when we were better armed. But there's two things there. Did he press and provoke Japan without having enough resources to create deterrence? Yes. In other words, if you look at what we had in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor, we were not equipped to match our rhetoric. So we started giving ultimata to the Japanese. But remember, the 7th Fleet had been based in San Diego as late as January. And they took it all away and stuck it out in Pearl Harbor just a year before it got attacked. And Admiral Richardson resigned, and they fired him. He said, this is crazy. You're going to put 9 old battleships out there and get them on. And then we only have 3 carriers that'll wipe us out. We've got to keep them in San Diego. So they wanted a confrontation, but as far as knowing that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor on that particular date, they didn't know. They should have, but they didn't.
Great gratitude from National Review and from me personally to the Harrisons and the Spencers for hosting us here. The one thing I'm not grateful for is to have Jack schedule me to speak after Victor, which is never great to learn from Victor, but to follow up is not my favorite part of the day. But it's an honor to be here. It's an honor especially to be here with the colleagues I'm fortunate to join with. It's also an honor, or at least it's topical, to break some new, or at least to report on some news that's been broken. So I can tell you that in the last few minutes, the House Intelligence Committee voted to release the dossier, the famous, I'm sorry, not the dossier, the report that they have done on FBI conduct with respect to the investigations. So we're one step closer to getting to the bottom of what actually happened, but we're not anywhere, we're not quite close to that point yet. And I think maybe it's valuable, since that just happened, to try to talk about what the importance of it is, because I think, I must tell you, I was a prosecutor for about 8 years before I realized that the FBI had a night job. When I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office, like all other startup federal prosecutors, I did, mafia cases, drug cartel cases, money laundering cases, and the like. And I got asked to get into a terrorism case after the World Trade Center got bombed, mainly because we didn't have a paradigm for how to prosecute international terrorism. Fortunately, we hadn't had enough of it for that to be the case. And I think the reason they turned to me was because I had handled some international organized crime cases. And once we got into the case, we realized how very different that kind of crime was from what it was we were dealing with a jihadist terrorist movement. But it was the closest model that we had. And one of the first things that you discover is that the FBI, in addition to doing its very important criminal law enforcement mission, is actually our domestic security service. The CIA, by statute and by its own charter, is not allowed to operate inside the United States. And part of the fallout from Watergate and the church hearings in the 70s was that a lot of regulations, including some judicial oversight, was put in that had never been there before on the issue of what the executive branch can do in terms of national security to spy on international threats against the United States, including people who are operatives of foreign powers who operate within our borders to try to undermine our country, a number of whom are actually Americans. It's not a crime, in fact, in this country to be a foreign agent. There's a law that says that you have to register, and you have to let the Justice Department know, and you have to give them all sorts of disclosure. But most of the foreign agents that we worry about are people who are actually operating to undermine our government and our people, either in the way of being terrorist organizations. A terrorist organization, an international terrorist organization, is a foreign power under American law. And also we have our traditional geopolitical foes, of which Russia, I think, remains the most important, notwithstanding President Obama mocking Mitt Romney for pointing that out in a debate in 2012. I think as history's gone on, we see Mitt Romney had that right and Obama had that wrong. So we flash forward to what we're dealing with now, and what the House Intelligence Committee is specifically looking into is how did the FBI use its highly legally regulated national security, foreign intelligence collection powers in the run-up to the 2016 election, and it looks like also in the aftermath of the 2016 election. So we've heard a lot about a collusion narrative. This whole idea that Trump, or at least the Trump campaign, was somehow in cahoots with Russia, while Russia was involved in a cyber espionage operation in favor of Hillary Clinton's election, in favor of Trump's election, and to undermine Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And that is the Russia collusion narrative that the media has run with, actually since a time shortly before the election. It was a bit muted then, because everybody figured Hillary was going to win. The last thing they wanted to do was suggest that there was any taint of any kind involved in that. But there were some reporting and inklings about Trump connections to Russia before the election. However, after the election, when Hillary miraculously lost and they needed a rationale, something other than the fact that they had nominated a historically poor candidate who ran a historically poor campaign to rationalize why they lost. And suddenly, once that came to pass, that was when we had real picking up steam of the collusion narrative. And what we've learned along the way is that the national intelligence side of the FBI's house, for whatever reason, at the leadership level, decided that Trump was unfit to be president. There's a lot of personal animus there, and I think what you learn seeing that is that the bias, I think, made the FBI leadership kind of like an open door to be pushed on when the so-called Steele dossier showed up. So they get this report. It's a series of intelligence reports, or quote-unquote intelligence reports. It's actually a rank rumor. But it's brought to them by a former British intelligence agent, Christopher Steele, who actually was never physically present in Russia while he was gathering these reports. They're all transmitted to him via hearsay by this network of people that he supposedly has from when he was an intelligence agent working Russia. And it, of course, as we now know, contains a lot of salacious allegations about Trump. But also, very importantly, it contains flat-out allegations that Trump was involved in cahoots, in conspiracy with the Russians in an espionage operation against the United States and against the election, really, with the intention, supposedly, of undermining Mrs. Clinton's candidacy. And the big problem with it is, aside from the fact that it's all hearsay, it's unverified and has been unverified from the start. So, for example, FBI Director, or former FBI Director, James Comey, who was an old friend of mine, I started with him in the U.S. Attorney's Office about 30 years ago. He testifies at a Senate hearing in June of last year, June of 2017, that the Steele dossier is unverified. Well, if it's unverified in June of 2017, it has to have been unverified in September of 2016, when we now know that the FBI and the Justice Department went to the FISA court, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and got authority to spy at least on one person who was connected to Trump's campaign, but almost certainly a broader web of targets that they wanted to do surveillance on the theory, as they have described it, that Trump was vulnerable to being blackmailed by Putin. So the question here that we're dealing with is, did they in fact do that? Did they bring this unverified screed of hearsay, unverified, anonymous information to a U.S. court to get authority to spy not only on Americans, but isn't the incumbent Democratic administration using its federal foreign intelligence collection authority to actually undermine and conduct surveillance on the opposition party's presidential candidate, which would be, if it happened, a Watergate dimension scandal, or at least it ought to be. In fact, part of the articles of impeachment against Nixon back in 1973-74 was the effort to use the FBI and the executive branch's other investigative agencies against political opponents. But for the most part, what we know from history is those agencies said no. The White House attempted to exploit them, but they weren't able to. This is a case of actual exploitation. It's a case, apparently, where they go to a court and get a warrant and get authority to spy. So I think what we're dealing with, and what I believe we'll remember of the 2016 election, is that it's a tale of two collusions. One of them is the collusion narrative that we've heard really with great intensity since the election, and that is this whole idea that Trump conspired with Russia. That appears by the day to be disintegrating, to the point that the special counsel that's been appointed to look at Trump actually seems to be shifting his investigation away from collusion and towards something else, like obstruction. There's some talk that they're looking into Trump's financial records to see if there's any irregularities in there. There's a huge problem with this because federal law says if you appoint a special counsel, the government, the Justice Department, is supposed to articulate a crime that the Justice Department is too conflicted to investigate, and that requires the appointment of the special counsel. And the reason the articulation of the crime is important is our history with special counsels, or independent prosecutors, or special prosecutors, whatever you like to call them. Our history with them is very unhappy. They usually start looking at one thing, and then by the time they're done, 4, 5, 8 years later, they're someplace way remote from where they started in the first place. And at least in those instances, whether it's Watergate or Iran-Contra or the Clinton-Lewinsky thing, at least at the beginning, you know what crime you're investigating. Here, they never articulated a crime. So Mueller actually has pretty much carte blanche. He's got a very wide ambit of things that he can look into, and that gets coupled with the fact that the Justice Department has shown no eagerness to exercise any supervision over him whatsoever. So even with all that, it looks like he's shifting away from the thing that was the premise for the appointment of the special counsel in the first place, collusion with Russia, and looking for some other crime to prosecute. And the only thing we can conclusively say about that is so far he's brought 3 sets of charges against 4 people. And there's not a whisper in any of it about collusion with Russia, at least collusion that is in any way criminal or smacks of espionage. So that's the one collusion narrative that's really been broadcast at us with great intensity since November. The other collusion narrative, which I think is not only going to be a narrative, but something that is actually true, is the degree to which the intelligence and law enforcement arms of our government were put in the service of a political campaign. And that has 2 aspects. One of it, the first of it, is the degree to which the FBI bent over backwards, contorted itself every which way in order to avoid prosecuting Hillary Clinton, notwithstanding very substantial evidence that she mishandled classified information, destroyed government records, and obstructed justice. And I think any objective person looking at this, regardless of what your political inclinations are, it simply is not possible to look at the way that they handled Mrs. Clinton's investigation and the way they scorched the earth in Trump's investigation and come to the conclusion that we have an equal measure of justice in both. It's simply not possible. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the aspect that the Intelligence Committee is really focused on now, which is, did, in a pretextual, dishonest way, did the FBI and the Justice Department go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and get permission to spy on Trump's campaign? And what we know about that so far is that that went on probably into May of 2017. That is to say, what we've heard is that there was an initial warrant that was issued in September or October of 2016 during the stretch run of the campaign, and that warrant has been reauthorized twice, or renewed twice. The way FISA law works, they're 90-day intervals. So at the conclusion of the first order, you either decide we're not getting anything out of this surveillance, let's put a stop to it, or you go back to the FISA court and you say, this has been really useful, we'd like to go up for another 90 days. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that Trump was president for the first 4 months or so while that was all going on. So it's very important to get to the bottom of, did they spy on the Trump campaign and the Trump administration? Did they accurately represent evidence and the source of evidence to the court in order to get permission to conduct surveillance? And what have they done since? What have they done since they got the first order? Why did they continue the operation even after the election? And of course, the main thing is how much of it is politics and how much of it is real. There's no one, I'm sure, in this room, myself included, whether you voted for Trump with enthusiasm, whether you voted for him without enthusiasm because you were never Hillary, or whether you didn't vote for him at all. I don't think anybody questions the idea that if we actually had somebody who was close to becoming president or who was president, who had a tie of an espionage nature to a foreign power that's adversarial to American interests, that's a president we don't want. And that's a president who ought to be investigated and ought to be impeached. On the other hand, if they use that portent, if they use that prospect as a pretext to do spying, then it turns out that it wasn't Trump and the collusion narrative that attacked the American election. It was our own incumbent government agencies, our own intelligence agencies, our premier law enforcement agencies, and the opposition campaign. We now know that Hillary Clinton's campaign was the source of the Steele dossier. So given all the allegations that have gone back and forth, it really is important to get to the bottom of who exactly is it, if anyone, who attacked the American electoral system. And I do think when we get to the end of it, we're going to conclude at least this, it wasn't Trump. So with that, why don't I take some questions?
If I may, later when we have the three, Rich Lowry will come later, when we're all speaking, I'll propose a question at the time about what we think of Obama and his role not only in that and the private emails with Hillary and the rest. So, but that's not to say that anyone here can ask such a question. So would anyone like to ask a question of Andy? Go ahead.
When you talk about renewing the FISA warrant every 90 days, do they have to come up with a new rationale, or can they just say we're in progress? I mean, would they have had to present this dossier over and over and over again? How does that work?
Right, it's a great question. Because there's a very important difference between what you have to show to get a FISA warrant versus what you have to show to get a normal criminal wiretap, which is what I basically did before I did terrorism cases. To get a normal wiretap, you have to show the court that there's probable cause that a crime has been committed and that the phone that you want to tap or the place that you want to put a bug in is a place where there's probable cause to believe that you're going to generate evidence of the crime. So it's strictly about violations of federal law. You have to show that in order to get a wiretap. FISA is different. Under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which again only started in 1978. Prior to 1978, this was not a legally regulated process, other than by internal executive branch rules. So they create this court role in 1978. And the idea is you have to show probable cause that a person is acting as an agent of a foreign power, which means basically they're furthering the foreign power's interests in the United States. And importantly, if the person who you want to do the spying on is an American citizen, an American person, they say in federal law, which means citizens and green card holders. But if the person is an American person, in addition to showing probable cause that the person's an agent of a foreign power, you also have to show probable cause that the behavior the person is engaging in violates federal criminal law. And the reason I stress that is the target of the FISA surveillance is this guy Carter Page, who was a minor figure in the Trump campaign. The reason it's worth bringing up is, I don't know of anybody, I mean, now we never know everything the FBI knows, right? But I don't know of anybody who knows any allegation in Page's life that he violated federal law in any way, other than what's laid out in the Steele dossier. Page is an Annapolis graduate. He was a naval intelligence officer. He's an interesting character. But I'm not aware, and I've looked at this pretty closely, and I haven't seen any reporting anywhere that he's ever, been anything other than a Boy Scout as far as the criminal law is concerned. The Steele dossier alleges that he's in the focal point of this Trump conspiracy with Putin to do hacking and all the other stuff they did to undermine the election. So that's what you have to show to get a FISA. Now, when the 90 days comes up, you have to show the court that there's still probable cause to believe the foreign agent of the foreign power business. There's still probable cause that there's violations of American law going on, and the warrant is still useful in terms of gathering important intelligence to protect the national security of the United States. So every time they go back, presumably if they go back and they say we haven't developed anything in the last 90 days, the only way you would get a reauthorization is if you can say, let's say it's a phone, and you can say the person's been out of state or vacationing somewhere for 90 days, and that's the reason there was no activity. Then the court might roll with it and give you one more extension. But other than that, what you're supposed to show the court is that this is still a fruitful surveillance installation, and it's still generating information. So it'll be very interesting if we ever find out to see what it was they were telling the courts they were getting from this surveillance. And the reason I say if we ever find out, and this is why what Devin Nunes and his committee are trying to do is so difficult, everything about FISA is highly classified. The applications are classified. They don't even want to tell you what the format that they use to file an application in the court is. That everything is top secret. So it's very, very hard to get information about it. And the danger of that, and I can say this not just in principle, but having seen this process as a prosecutor for a number of years, the danger is we really need to have secrecy because we can't protect the country without it. We can't protect the sources of information. We can't protect important intelligence installations that are giving us life-saving intelligence without it. But it's a very attractive vehicle for the government to hide conduct that's either embarrassing or illegal. Because it's all going to be top secret, and they can always say, when somebody wants to pry into it, methods and sources, and nobody in Congress wants to be responsible for compromising information that ends up getting a source killed. Right? So it's tough work they're trying to do.
Was the Steele dossier the first application? Is that the timeline?
The question is whether the Steele dossier is the first application for surveillance. We think so. And there's good reason to think so because they were leaking like sieves to the media about the time that they went to the court. So we know that they got the warrant, based on the reporting that's pretty reliable, they got the warrant, say, sometime probably late September, early October. And that was the time when, as we know, this outfit that Steele was working for, Fusion GPS, made him available to the media. And he was also doing briefings for government people who were then briefing Congress, and there were stories about that in the media. So the indications are that the same stuff that Steele told the FBI, which is what we think ended up in the warrant, is the same stuff that Steele and Fusion GPS were telling the media at around that time. So we think it's September, October.
I just had one quick, I shouldn't be asking a question, but maybe we're all interested in it. And that is, can you comment on the names that came out in association with the unmasking and making Smith of Powell, Susan Rice? And specifically, if you would do that,
were they trying to disseminate incriminating information to the FISA court, and was that parallel to the Steele Direct efforts to get stuff out? How were they getting, what was the point of all that?
Unmasking is a concept in foreign intelligence selection that doesn't necessarily relate to FISA surveillance. There's mainly two kinds of collection that go on in FISA. One is a particularized warrant. So I say X person is acting as an agent of a foreign power. I go to a court and I get a surveillance warrant. Just like in a criminal thing, I'd say, I think this guy's a button man for the mafia, and they give me a criminal wiretap, right? That's a particularized warrant to get permission to do surveillance on a particular person. Then there are very general sweeping programs that we do to massively collect intelligence and to exploit the technological capabilities that we now have that we didn't have. I mean, they weren't even dreamed of when FISA was first enacted. And what happens is they have the capacity to intercept thousands of communications, millions of communications, really, involving situations where at least one person is a non-American, or at least they have reason to believe the person is non-American. And this is difficult too, because with the new telephony we have, Victor and I could be sitting across the room from each other, or Victor and I should say, Victor could be in Pakistan, I could be in Afghanistan, he could text me and that could go through a US system, which is, the importance of that is it brings the court into it, because now the communications are transiting through our system. This used to be something the courts didn't get involved in because it was all overseas intelligence collection. So what happens when you do any kind of a surveillance is you get people who are not targeted to be collected on, who are incidentally picked up. Think about it in a criminal wiretap on the mafia. The Don decides he wants a pizza, and he picks up the phone and calls a pizza. You get the pizza guy on the warrant, right? Or you get the pizza guy in the interceptions. You're not targeting, but if you're going to follow somebody, you're going to pick up everybody that the person is associated with. So, because this is not crime, because it's intelligence collection, they put in the law extra protections for Americans. And those protections include that when an American is incidentally picked up in foreign intelligence collection, when they write the reports based on the raw, they take the raw collection and they refine it into intelligence reports. You're not supposed to put the name of the American in the intelligence report. You have to call him American number 1, or U.S. Senator number 1, or whatever, but you're not allowed to use the name. So here's the very interesting thing the Obama administration did right before Obama left. The president issues an order only a few days before the administration ends, widening the dissemination of people in the in the intelligence community who can get access to raw intelligence data and get access to refined intelligence reports.
That's before the election.
After the election. Only a few days before he left office. Okay?
But how did he do it?
He issued an executive order. So in other words, what used to happen is there's only a few agencies that are involved in deciding who gets unmasked. What can happen when you have these intelligence reports, let's say you're the national security advisor and you think, boy, this is an interesting piece of information, but I'd really like to know who the American is, and I need to know that to exploit the intelligence value. And that's usually very legitimate. It's not political. But it doesn't happen that often. What they seem to have done in the last year is there was a major uptick in the unmasking of Americans. In other words, when they unmask, what it means is instead of being American number 1, your name is put in the report. Right, exactly. And the interesting thing about that, if you take the whole situation in toto, is so you have this uptick in unmasking. You have Samantha Power, who is the UN ambassador, who has no discernible intelligence reason to be asking for unmasking, asked for unmasking 260 times. And then when she was brought into one of the congressional committees to testify about it, she said she's not the one who did it. She doesn't question that it was done, but she says, whoever did that in my name, it wasn't me. So we know she was involved, we know Brennan, who was the head of the CIA, was involved, we know the National Security Advisor, Rice, was involved. And you can't look at this in a vacuum. What was also going on at the time was they were expanding the number of people who had access to these reports. And then we know from this Evelyn Farkas, who was an Obama administration Defense Department advisor or official, that the Obama administration, after Trump got elected, encouraged Congress to ask for as much information as they could that the intelligence committee had, or the intelligence community had, about Trump and people around Trump. And then what's the final piece that we had? We had massive leaking. And we've had massive leaking of intelligence reporting about people whose identities were unmasked. So when you put it all together, it looks like there was a pretty vast, it looks like there could have been a pretty vast conspiracy to push out intelligence information that was incidentally gathered against these people because they were connected to Trump. And the obvious question that comes out of that is, did they rig that? In other words, did they try to spy on foreign people, not because they necessarily wanted to collect information about those foreign people, but because they knew that those people were associating with Trump, and that was a kind of an indirect way to get surveillance on those people. So it's yet another thing that we have to look into that we'll probably never get to the bottom of, but we gotta try.
Thank you, everyone. First, I want to thank the Harrises for their incredible generosity of sponsoring us here in their beautiful home in the Spencers, for making this event possible. And, you know, as editor of National Review, sometimes people who don't know much about my daily routine ask, what is it that you really do? And I hate to admit it, but a large part of what I do is take undue credit for the incredible work of others. And Victor Davis Hanson and Andy McCarthy are right there on the top of that list, and in my mind, two of the most talented and important writers in our country. So I'm just delighted to be able to call those two colleagues. So I'm the editor of National Review. I'm also a political pundit, and a rough and ready working definition of a political pundit would be someone who is wrong with impunity. So I would like, though, to, whenever I talk about current politics, to engage in a little self-accountability. There are at least two big things I've gotten wrong over the last year or so. One, I didn't think Trump was going to win. Most of the time, I didn't rule it out. I thought there was about a 40% chance, say, that he would win in November 2016 and beat Hillary Clinton and become president of the United States. But with the fullness of time and from this juncture, the chances that all that would happen looks to be more like, I don't know, I'm not a statistician, but 100%. So I was wrong about that. And I was also worried that he would be too much of an unmoored populist. And I have some worries on the score still, but it hasn't been true. It's been really a solidly conservative agenda. And I'll address that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But first, I want to say, Victor mentioned in the beginning of his remarks stealing horses, which reminded me of one of my favorite lines, actually from FDR's grandfather, Franklin Delano, a good dyed-in-the-wool Republican, used to like to say, it's not that all Democrats are horse thieves, it's just that all horse thieves are Democrats. and then I want to come briefly touch on what Andy was so adeptly discussing. We really have, obviously, an intense and oftentimes toxic political debate in this country at the moment. And some of it's Trump. You know, he's always stirring the pot. Sometimes he's doing it strategically and for some purpose. Sometimes he's just doing it to entertain himself. You know, it's really true that when things are getting quiet and when they seem to be really going smoothly, he gets bored. And you can just see him sitting in his pajamas on his bed watching cable TV early in the morning or late at night, and just thinking, this is really boring. What can I do to make everyone's heads explode? And sure enough, there goes the tweet, there goes the banner on CNN, and the media has its marching orders for the next 12 to 36 hours. Tucker Carlson said a couple months ago, and I think this is really insightful, that Trump once said to him, it's not polls that are most important, it's ratings. And if nothing else, this presidency is rated really well. No one can take their eyes off of it. So that's part of the reason the debate is so intense. But one of the reasons it is so poisonous goes to what Andy was talking about. It's the left cannot accept the legitimacy of Trump's election and is beholden to this absurd fantasy that he's somehow going to go away. I was walking onto the set of a TV news program, and I won't mention the name to protect the guilty, except for to say it rhymes with Morning Joe. And I was off here, the cameras are off, and I come up, and everyone's sort of relaxed, and one of the panelists asked me, so Rich, how long do you think it's going to last? And I was like, what? And how long do you think Trump's presidency is going to last? And I said, I don't know, to 2020 or 2024? And this blew her mind. It hadn't even occurred to her that might be the case. And I've talked to audiences in New York, and I'll refer to things I think Trump might do in 2019, and there are groans of disbelief that he might last that long. But I think if there's anything we know about Trump, this is a guy who likes attention. So the idea that we have, as a country, given him the biggest megaphone on the planet. We have given him the White House, Camp David, Air Force One, Marine One, Marine Guards who salute him every time he walks out of the office. And he's just going to say, screw it. I'd rather do something else. I prefer to do a weekly segment on Fox and Friends again. That's just never going to happen. And they also have these fantasies right at the beginning. There's going to be an electoral college coup. The electors aren't going to certify Trump's election, even though he duly won. Or we're going to have impeachment or removal. Or we're going to have, as Michael Wolff was feeding this just 3 weeks ago, we're going to have the 25th Amendment invoked against him by his own cabinet members because he's so addle-brained. And this is one of the amazing things to me about the government shutdown. It's not just that the Democrats lost the shutdown, they lost the shutdown to a president that just 2 weeks prior they thought was demented, right? So what does that tell you about Chuck Schumer's strategy? So, on the agenda, the judges have been amazing. Gorsuch will, God willing, be there for the next 30 years. Will have an enormous impact on this country and protecting the Constitution when Trump is long gone. 12 appellate court nominees the first year, a record. If Republicans hold the Senate and they do that for the next 4 years, that's like a generational achievement. The regulations, they've done everything they can to roll back the regulations on every single front. These are two extremely important things. These are things that I think fairly, any Republican president would do. But there's some things that I think other Republican presidents wouldn't do, just because they wouldn't have had the sheer cojones for it. Pulling out of the Paris Accords, decertifying or refusing to certify the Iran deal, declaring, even though it shouldn't take much courage because it's simply true, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Only a president like Trump who is so willing to defy polite opinion, to rip up polite opinion and throw it in the nearest wastebasket would do any of these things. And it creates around him a little bit of sense of risk, a little bit of sense of danger, and that in some ways can be a very good thing. One of my favorite headlines the last few weeks, Wall Street Journal, I think it was Thursday or Friday, front page story, Iranian gunboats stop harassing U.S. Navy ships. No one knows why. That's it. I gotta guess why they're no longer harassing our ships. And really though, the tipping point the last year was the passage of the tax bill. If Trump and the Republican Congress hadn't managed to do that, the party would be in a free fall right now. Donors would want to quit on it. Voters would want to quit on it because they would have had this incredible gift of unified control of the federal government and would have come up with a legislative goose egg the first year. That would have been unacceptable. I think you would have seen all these kind of kooky insurgent Senate candidates getting a big boost. And I'm not necessarily in favor of all Senate candidates that the establishment endorses. We've gone out on a limb and had a bunch of conservative insurgent candidates, the last 6 years on our covers. But as Alabama proved, you can't run creeps and hope to win Senate seats. And just kicking away any of these seats is a disaster. So the tax bill, passage tax bill helped, I think, mute some of those candidates. Plus, for some reason, Steve Bannon thought it would be a brilliant idea to spill his guts to Michael Wolff and to pose as the greatest Trump defender in all of the United States of America. At the same time, he's insulting Donald Trump's children, okay? I don't know Trump as well as Bannon does, but I knew that would not end well, and it has not ended well. He's a smoldering ruin. So I think one of the good things that's happened over the last year, Bannon's ousted, Bannon's marginalized, and Trump is engaged in this marriage now with the congressional leadership. They have managed to hold it together, and that is very important. There have been rocky moments. After Obamacare went down, Trump seemed as though he was turning on Mitch McConnell. You heard rumors that Trump was starting to refer to Mitch McConnell as low energy, and that's not a place you want to be with President Trump. And there's some stories about sniping back and forth. There was a story, I think, in the New York Times about an emotional, is the way they put it, an emotional phone call between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. And one of McConnell's guys called me and he was trying to back down this story, and he says, "Rich, this can't be true, because Mitch McConnell doesn't have emotions." That was his defense. But McConnell kept his head down and realized that there's no reason to take the bait. It is much more important that everyone get along and keep the eye on the ball and try to do things while they still have the ability to do things. And that's a very good thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the political environment, the upcoming midterms, is great. It is not. Republicans just have a 24-seat House majority. With any Republican president or Republican Congress in a midterm election, a majority that relatively narrow would be at risk. And it is indeed at risk. But the best thing Republicans have going in their favor is the hope that with the economy kicking into a higher gear, with the tax bill creating a lot of good news, that'll take the edge off whatever Democratic wave might be building out there. And it seems as though maybe that's happening. There's some early indications. The generic congressional ballot end of the year was double digits for Democrats, which would be a debacle. You've had some polls lately that have about 6 points in favor of the Democrats. That's manageable. The way the seats are configured in the House, Republicans can lose the overall vote in the country by about 4 points and still have, basically break even. So if they lost it by 6 points, they'd lose seats, but they'd probably hold the majority. And I think they're definitely going to lose seats. The Democrats are going to come close, but it makes an enormous difference whether the Democrats are 1 seat short of the majority or 1 seat in the majority. If they're 1 seat short, it would be hilarious. 2, it would create a civil war in the party because they really think they're going to sweep everything because they really think everyone agrees with them about Trump. A lot of these folks, they never meet anyone who supports Trump, so it blows their minds that they're actually people who back the president. And 3, this is probably most important, it makes a difference between subpoena power or not. And if they get majority, they might not impeach him, certainly if it's a narrow majority, but they will do everything they can to subpoena his tax records, women, anything they can think of to try to troll him into a constitutional crisis. And it's best not to see how that's going to turn out. And by one point of view, that's what's happening now with the Mueller investigation. And one reason why I think it would be a horrendous mistake for Trump to agree to testify under oath in the Mueller investigation. And Andy wrote an extremely well-informed piece about this over the weekend. But my take on it is, even if Trump has nothing to hide, which I believe is true, even if he's determined to completely tell the truth, it still might not happen. And I have a friend who knows an advance man for the Trump campaign, and there's a rally in Virginia that Trump was having. And Trump was in the green room. He hadn't been out front. He hadn't seen how big the crowd was. And he was interested in crowd size. So he asked this guy, how many people are out there? And he said, sir, it's tremendous. Packed to the rafters, 5,000 people. Trump says, 8,000 people? That's amazing. And then he gets on his phone and he's like, hey Jimmy, you won't believe it. I'm down here in Roanoke with crowd 10,000 people. Did he like deliberately go out of his way to lie? No, it's just he's been a real estate promoter. A guy who's survived in tabloid New York for so long. That's the way he thinks, right? If you're not timesing it by 3, you're selling yourself short. So I'll just conclude with one last thing. For me, it sort of summarizes the way this year has gone. I got back from Thanksgiving break, went to my office after being gone for several days, and on my seat, on my chair, is a brown envelope from the White House. So I'm curious, I open it up, and there's a ripped out page from the New York Post. And I write a syndicated column that runs in the New York Post. And I love the New York Post. I consider it the nation's most authoritative newspaper, and so does the President of the United States. So wherever he is, he wants to read the New York Post. And it turns out that this was a ripped out copy from a page of the Post that was printed for him when he was in Asia. He was on his Asia trip. He ripped out this page that had my column on it, and I had written about how in the wake of the Virginia gubernatorial race, which the Republican lost, even though the Republican Ed Gillespie tried to run away from Trump, I was just sort of making the point, Trump's such a dominating presence, there's no escaping him, even if you try. And I said some disparaging things about what Trump might be doing to the party's political chances, but the headline on the column was, "There is only Trump." So Trump didn't actually read the column. He fastened on the headline, "There is only Trump." Circled it with his big black marker, pointed an arrow, wrote a note, "Rich, so true. Donald J. Trump." Thank you very much.
I'm going to give this back to Rich, but Rich is here in Fresno today. What were your other options for the day? And then also talk about the Buckley legacy a little.
So believe it or not, I had 2 choices. I could be faithful to my commitment to all of you and show up and be in this wonderful room with a lot of wonderful people, or I could have been at the White House today at a briefing with President Trump. Seriously. Did I make the right choice? Sort of 2 questions.
Yeah, just talk about the Buckley legacy a little bit.
Oh, sure. So, Bill Buckley, the great founder of our magazine, had this idea 60 years ago that if you created a magazine just devoted to certain principles and certain truths about our country, this magazine could change the world and have a devoted followership of friends who would support it no matter what. And against all expectations, that has been true. It continues to be true. We don't publish this our magazine to make money or to sell glossy ads. Fancy advertisers do not want to be associated with a right-wing magazine of opinion. So we have always depended on readers and supporters to make it possible for us to fund our endeavor. Bill Buckley used to say, National Review exists to make a point, not a profit. Unfortunately, we have stayed true to that maxim throughout our entire existence, and it's only the friendship and incredible generosity of folks like you that keep our enterprise alive, keep Bill Buckley's voice alive, and make sure there's at least one institution in America that's devoted to the truths that make this country great, no matter what. So we really appreciate all of you doing that. So any questions?
Jack,
Yes.
they didn't announce about the wine glasses? That's a critical question.
The wine glasses
That say National Review Institute.
that say National National Review Institute.
Trying to see if they crack.
What was that wine you were serving?
Crew, a delicious Crew and Mariposa wine. I'm a member of the club. Are you? And not only do you bring a Victor Davis Hanson book home with you and a National Review magazine home with you, but you bring a National Review Institute etched wine glass with you, which only can hold Crew wine. I think now we're going to have questions.
Thanks, Derek. Welcome. Yeah, we can yell, right? Okay, well, the boss, the owners first. Push it up. Here. Well done.
I always thought Trump was going to win. And it's kind of like a horse race. You just have to keep hitting and hitting, and you don't like to look back. You just keep hitting till you cross the finish line. And we were supporters of Trump, and we knew a lot of people that weren't because they didn't like him or they didn't think he was going to win, and it was a waste of money. But I think you just have to hit it hard. But anyway, my question to you is, sometimes in the magazine you sort of do cartoons of him or whatever, and sometimes there were articles that really didn't, it was kind of critical. Are you still doing that?
Take the microphone away.
So the short answer is yes. First of all, the cartoons. Our cartoonist is a guy named Roman Ginn, who draws hideous likenesses of everyone. It really doesn't matter who he or she is. He's occasionally, for occasions, anniversaries of my editorship or whatever, had to draw me, and I always just cringe and never want to see it because he's a caricaturist and he's going to exaggerate your features, and it's not going to look very pretty, but sometimes it's amusing. So there are things about Trump that some of our writers are never going to be on board with. There's disagreements on trade, there are disagreements on spending issues, there are disagreements about sort of how he conducts himself. So for me, I share those concerns, but the question is just how large do they loom for you? And for me, and I think if you read the magazine in the aggregate in its entirety, the good is overwhelming the bad. If I could control his Twitter feed, he would still have tweets, but there wouldn't be any tweets that would create self-defeating problems for himself. And I think sometimes he's just overly self-indulgent in that way, and I wish he wouldn't do it. And it creates problems for his administration. But, as I laid out, if you look at the substantive things that he's done, I think that is more important than these other issues. And it's just, the fact is, if you have a company coming back into the U.S. and investing in a plant, that has more real-world effect on an actual person than any tweet possibly can. But this is I think the issue is we have this kind of poisonous froth of a political debate in our country that risks making everyone feel much worse about the country than the actual conditions justify. So if I had my druthers, if I were Trump, and he'll never do this, but I'd step back a little bit, do a little jiu-jitsu, let the press continue to go crazy, let the left continue to go crazy, which they will, and discredit themselves, while I'm just the unifying guy who's pointing out how wonderful the economy is going and how my policies are working. I think that would be a better approach. And we're going to have people who are continuing to say that, and advise that he do that. So we're never going to be like just 100% cheerleaders. But when he's being attacked unfairly, or when he's supporting good policies that are going to be good for the country and the left is opposing them for ideological reasons, we're going to be right there supporting him. And I think if you look at the magazine, the balance of it has been supportive of what he's doing.
I disagree with you 100%.
This is a dangerous, you pointed dangerously.
Be nice, be gentle.
Twitter is to me the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He defends himself to no end. I watched Bush 1, Bush 2 sit there and never defend themselves. And the day he won, I agree with Carol what she said. I never had any doubt that he was not going to win. But when you guys have the never Trumper attitude, it really ticks me off when I stop looking at your website. He gave us 100% water this year, when in the same time, 4 or 5 years ago, we got 80%. So I really think he's staying true to his word. He came to Fresno once for free, and Fresno twice for money. Best money I ever spent, and I highly recommend everybody back him 110%, because in this room I see very heavy water people, and it is just a treat to see things running at capacity, because the federal pumps are running so much better than the state pumps. The feds filled their side. It's just amazing what we're seeing. And I think you guys need to go with it. And, you know.
I'm not going to interrupt Rich, but I'm interrupting. But I encourage you to read National Review, the one magazine that talks regularly about the water issues here. So,
I would just say, one, I mean, we've been extremely supportive of all the land use, water, regulatory policies. It's all wonderful, it's all plus. But the tweets, let me just suggest some tweets. I'm not saying you never should tweet. You know, as he said during the campaign, Twitter's like running the New York Times, except for not losing money. I mean, it's an incredible megaphone for him. And if you look at the shutdown, I think that's the way he should use Twitter. It's not like he got off Twitter, but just every single tweet, in his own way, in his own words, with weird capitalization.
I think you've lost touch, because I think that's resonating with so many more people than you can imagine. That I think it is one of the biggest winning things I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, well, I mean, we'll disagree. But the problem is like most audiences I speak to, they're on board all the tweets. The problem we have is Republican women in the suburbs who just, because of the way he behaves, are reacting to him personally. What's that?
Lost last year.
What's that?
Okay, according to your polls, a year and a half ago, you should have lost. You're quoting polls that we don't know what's true or not true, because most of them are so biased that it's hard to take seriously.
Maybe. I mean, it's just, we've lost a lot of, we lost the Virginia gubernatorial race. We lost Alabama, we've lost some other sort of marginal seats, and it's because there's a reaction in the suburbs. So maybe it's not going to show up in November.
Gloria Allred caused problems in Alabama. I mean, there are so many things when they attack one individual that heavy, I mean, I'm sure it did turn people off. But
just one last thing, I'm happy to continue with you off mic. But the other thing is, like, not every other candidate is Donald Trump. And he has sort of this unique ability to play this way and get away with it and diminish his adversaries in a way other people can't. So the problem is, if you have a sort of anti-Trump reaction without Trump on the ballot, it might swamp these other more conventional Republicans. But we'll see. Look, I've been wrong before, and I've admitted it.
Going back to what you said about thinking he had about a 40% chance to win. In retrospect, looking at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, do you think any of the other Republican candidates could have carried those states?
I think it's unlikely. I think if another Republican would have won, and there's no way it's an unknowable proposition at this point, it would have been a more conventional map. But, Pat Toomey, for whatever it's worth, I have no idea, he thinks in that year against Hillary Clinton, any Republican would have won Pennsylvania. And it's interesting because if you look at how Trump and Toomey won Pennsylvania, they both won it, but in slightly different ways. because Trump, you look at a working class town that traditionally has been more democratic, Trump overperforms there. Then you look at a more sort of upscale, overperforms Toomey there. We look at a more upscale, suburban-oriented district, Toomey overperformed Trump there. So maybe there were two separate paths to winning Pennsylvania that year. One for a more conventional, cautious Republican like Toomey, one for a more unorthodox Republican like Trump. But look, it's impossible to know. And these are my couple principles just for myself with dealing with Trump and Trump era. One, I don't take anything personal. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to admit I'm wrong. Two, never get caught up in the hysteria. Because no matter what it is, or how important it seems in a news cycle, it is always overplayed. And basically my answer, anytime when I'm in any panel asked, oh, Rich, how do you think this is going to play out, whatever the controversy is, I say it's going to be forgotten in 36 hours, right? That's just the world we live in. And then finally, I have a friend who works for a free market group that wasn't very enthusiastic about Trump, but worked very closely with him on the tax bill and tried to get the healthcare bill over the top. And a couple weeks ago, he asked me, Rich, what are you most grateful for from the Trump presidency so far? And my answer, quite sincerely, was everything. It's like an incredible windfall that Republicans have these majorities, have a president who basically he'll sign anything, right? He's not picky. As long as he can sign a bill and there's a signing ceremony, he will do it, right? So, and compared to where we would be with Hillary, it's a blessing, and they should get as much done as quickly as possible, because maybe a deluge isn't coming, and they'll hold everything come November. But maybe they won't. So it's really important to get stuff done under that wire.
Just to sort of tag onto that, with all of the things you have to pick from, what do you think some of the upcoming headlines are going to be in the next couple of weeks? What do you see on the horizon that maybe we're not attuned to yet?
Well, this isn't a secret, but the immigration debate is a big deal. And this is something where I think Trump has, moved the balance of opinion in the party in a direction that I think is much healthier, because I think the elites of both parties were kind of beholden to a dated orthodoxy on immigration. And I think you've seen in the last year a number of center-left intellectuals saying, you know what, the Democrats have gone too far on immigration. The Democrats are too far left on immigration. And you wouldn't have that beginning of a change in elite opinion if Trump hadn't won, and won by running on immigration so starkly. And now we have this debate about what to do with DACA. And I think the White House proposal last week was a very serious one. It's a genuine attempt to try to get something that can get 60 votes in the Senate. Now, what can get 60 votes in the Senate is not what I would, write just if I had my own say-so as law. It's very painful to say we're going to have a broadly defined dreamer amnesty for 2 million people who are going to have a path to citizenship. But what they're asking on the other side of the ledger, if they can actually get, would be a really big deal. More structure on the border, including a wall in some places. More importantly, in my view, various changes in terms of the resources that ICE gets, in terms of legal authorities, so when you catch people at the border, you can actually turn them around and send them home. Because we are waving in a lot of people still that we catch, especially from Central America, an end to the visa lottery, which is a travesty, and an end to certain family reunification categories that make no sense. Now those would be ended right away. If you did that right away, you'd reduce legal immigration by 40%. Instead, they're saying, we're going to work through the backlog, and this diminishment in the amount of immigration we have is going to take place 6, 8, 10 years from now. And I think that's just a very realistic way to do it. And if they actually got this bill written into law, I think the odds are against it, but it's possible. I think it'd be the most significant victory for immigration hawks in a generation or more, and be his most important legislative accomplishment after the tax bill.
Your 30 minutes are up. So,
thank you very much, everyone. Not you.